Okay, it is just a minute after 6, so I think we will go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight for this Land Stewardship Seminar Series. Tonight is the last of our series, and we're covering noxious weed identification and management tonight. For those of you who this may be the first in the series that you're tuning in for, I'll just let you know that we normally host this series as an in-person event. This year we were forced to shake things up a little bit. So we have shortened the presentations, and they're not really meant to be a deep dive into these discussions. Instead, they are meant to be an overview with enough information to get you started. And then they'll point you in the direction of some additional resources and some folks locally that you can talk with to have those really in-depth discussions with, or maybe arrange for a site visit to your property. So my name is Haley Graff. I am the resource conservationist with the Flathead Conservation District. And I am joined here tonight by a couple of fellow staff members. We have Samantha Tappenbeck. She is the Conservation Program Manager. And then Fiona Handler is our Big Sky Watershed AmeriCorps member this term. Our presenter tonight will be Noel Jinings, and she is with the Flathead County Weed Department. I will let her introduce herself a little bit more in depth here in just a second. First, I want to go through a couple of housekeeping items. So by default, your camera and your microphone are turned off. If you have a question that you would like to ask during the presentation, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. It looks like two little speech bubbles. You can click that and then go ahead and type your question in, and we will have a question and answer session following Noel's presentation. If you would like to unmute yourself and ask your question directly to Noel, there is also an option to click a little raise hand button. It looks like a little raised hand symbol. You can click that, and we will unmute you during the question and answer session, and you can go ahead and ask your question at that time. During the presentation, Noel may mention some resources or links, things like that. And we will post those additional resources and links on our website along with the recording of this presentation. It takes us about a week to get that up on YouTube and then up on our website. So if there's a resource you're interested in, check back in about a week on our website for that. All right, today's webinar will consist of about a 45-minute presentation by Noel, which should leave us about 10 to 15 minutes for a question and answer session. All right, and then when you exit out of the webinar at the end, you will be automatically directed to a survey. We really encourage you to take just a couple of minutes to fill out that survey. We do use your answers to try and make our presentations better and offer better and better opportunities and better information as we do these series. So take just a couple minutes and do that. All right, and with that, Noel, I will go ahead and turn it over to you for your presentation.
All right, thank you, Haley. Hello, everybody. My name is Noel Jinings. I am the Flathead County Noxious Weed Education and Compliance Officer. It's a big title. I am in the Flathead County Weed Control District. That's the department that is the overarching department that I work for. And every county is mandated to have a weed district, and that's controlled by a board, and to have a compliance officer and a weed coordinator. So my supervisor is the weed coordinator. I'm gonna do a little bit of screen sharing here with you guys, if I can figure out how to. Haley, I'm failing. I don't have the screen share button across the top right now.
Look for it at the bottom of your screen.
I don't see it there either. I have the question and answer chat. Oh, there we go. Thank you, friend.
No problem.
All right, that's not what I want to share with you. So we're going to go over here. So what I'm sharing with you right now is Montana code, and this is where all of the weed control stuff lives. And this is actually a state mandate that mandates our program. So all the information you could possibly want to know about the weed law of the state of Montana can be found here. What I wanted to do to start out with is just give you guys a definition of what a noxious weed is, because a weed can be anything that you just don't desire. Any plant that's undesirable to you can be a weed, but to be a noxious weed, that puts it in a classification where it's regulated by law. So if you look down here, noxious weeds or weeds means any exotic species established or that may be introduced in the state that may render land unfit for agriculture, forestry, livestock, wildlife, or other beneficial uses, or that may harm native plant communities, and that is designated as a statewide noxious weed by rule of department or as a district noxious weed by a board following public notice of intent and public hearing. So there's two lists for noxious weeds. There's a state list, and that broad base goes all the way across Montana. And then there's a county list. Each county in the state can make a county specific list in addition to the state list. So the reason for that is because if you look at the state of Montana, there's so many vastly different environmental types. So something that is a problem for us here in Flathead Valley probably wouldn't even grow on the east side in some places. So each county can also have its own little extra list. So the state of Montana list includes 36 listed noxious weeds. And then there's also 5 other weeds that are listed on there that are called regulated plants. So what those are is those are weeds that are plants that can't be sold, they can't be distributed, that kind of stuff. They're not mandated in the same way in the state law that the actual regulated noxious weeds are. For the county list, there's 5 noxious weeds and 5 regulated plants. And that information can be found on our website. So in order for you to become familiar with what these noxious weeds are, you can either go onto our website, and I'll show you what that looks like. We have printed materials in the office, so you can always come in to the office and visit with me. Oh no, what did I do? I lost my screen here. Sorry, you guys. You can come in and visit me and get printed materials, or you can, there's a lot of different online resources, and those can be found, I think, here under useful links. There's a bunch of different resources that you can find there on the Flathead County Weed Department website. And I'm going to show you just a few examples of those. Stop doing that. I'm having technical difficulties. I apologize. Oh, okay. We're just going to click here then. So Montana State University has a lot of really, really great resources. If you go to their publications button, you can find all sorts of resources there that you can actually order. These Mont guides or publications almost everything is free. You have to go on and order it and look for what you want, but they have many different ID resources there. You can also bring plants into our office and we can send them off to a lab if we can't tell you what they are, or obviously you can just bring them in and visit with me and I can probably tell you what it is. Or you can go to the Shutter Diagnostic Lab yourself and you can submit samples. And there's instructions on how to do that. There's a form and then you send off an actual physical sample. Or they have this, if you go into the app store, they actually have an app where you can just take pictures of your plant and submit it that way and get a text back as to what it is. So there's so many different ways that you can figure out if the plant you're looking at is actually a noxious weed or just something native or whatever. So lots of tools there. So I'll talk real quick now that we kind of talked about how to figure out if plant's a noxious weed or not. So if it is a noxious weed, as a landowner in the state of Montana, you're mandated to take steps to get rid of the plant if it is a noxious weed. So there's many ways to do that. You can use herbicides, you can use different methods like grazing, cultivation. I'll talk about a little bit about biocontrol as well, but we'll start off with herbicides because that's usually the thing I get the most questions about. So when you're using an herbicide, there's a lot more to it than just going out and spraying a plant. There's timing, there's a lot of the herbicides are really specific to specific plants. So you want to make sure that the herbicide you're using is going to be effective on the plant that you're targeting. And other things, like a lot of people make the mistake that they think that if they use a higher quantity of herbicide or if they use more concentrated herbicide that it'll kill the plant better, but that's not the case. So I'll start out by just describing how an herbicide works. So basically the herbicide is taken up by the plant. So keeping that in mind, you want to make sure that you spray the herbicide on the plant at the exact right time to get the most effective results. So if you think about it in the life stage of a plant, so when a plant first comes out of the ground, a lot of people think that they need to kill it then because it's the most tender, right? And so it should be the most susceptible, but that's not true. So when a plant comes up out of the ground, the first stage of its life is kind of an absorption phase. So you think about the leaves are coming up, they're absorbing sunlight, they're, you know, the roots are absorbing water and minerals, and it's building up as much energy as it possibly can in that root system, so that then it can go into its reproductive phase, right? Where it shoots up the flower shoot and then flowers and seeds. When it's in that reproductive phase, it's in an output phase. So you have the beginning, that's an absorption phase, and the second part where it's an output phase. So when you want to target that plant with the herbicide is when it's absorbing things. So even though when it first comes out, you think that it's susceptible and it's still absorbing stuff, but with herbicides, you want as much surface area as possible to come into contact with that herbicide so that more of that herbicide can be drawn into the root system, because the more herbicide you get in that root system, the more effective kill you're going to get. So that window is dependent on the plant. Because some of our noxious weeds come up before others, but generally speaking, to target most of the plants that we have on our lists, that window of time is in the spring, and it's usually between like mid-May to mid-June. So that's kind of the target window for a lot of things. There are, of course, exceptions to every rule. There's a few plants on our lists that are susceptible to herbicide treatment in the fall. But for the most part, it's that window in the spring. So I talked about one common mistake, that people target things too early. I've already had people coming in and asking if they can rent our herbicide sprayer tanks. I've already had people calling and asking if they could get started with spraying weeds. No, everything's still dormant, nothing is alive. Most of the herbicides that the general public uses are not active in the soil. So it's not like if you spray it now, it's going to kill the plant before it starts growing. You really need to make contact with that live plant. Some other mistakes. Like I said, each plant, well, different herbicides affect different plants. So you really want to make sure that you properly identify your targets so that we can get you the right herbicide that's going to be most effective for you. It's not just a one size fits all kind of thing. There's not one herbicide that's going to kill every different noxious weed on our list, unfortunately. Timing, I talked to you guys about timing. So you just got to make sure you hit that sweet spot. A lot of people also, and they don't spray until they see the flower, because that's when the plant is the most obvious. And again, they're in an output phase at that point. So they're not absorbing as much of that herbicide as you need to have to actually get effective kill. You'll see the plant wilt down and it'll look like it died, but you didn't actually kill the root. You just kind of burned the top of the plant. Like I said, more is not better. A higher concentration of herbicide to water is not better. All of this stuff, when the manufacturers create the herbicides, you know, it's scientific stuff. So they have it figured out. So what the label says to mix it, the rate it says to mix it, that's what you do. You don't want to do any more than that, because you're just wasting your money at that point, really. And then you really gotta make sure that your equipment is the proper equipment for the job as well. So on that note, with your equipment, it's really, really, really important to calibrate it, because if you haven't calibrated your equipment, you don't know what rate of herbicide you're putting out on the land. So they're on our website. I'll show you that we have a little link. Nope, that's not the one I want. Go away. There's a bar across the top of my screen so that I can't get to my, well, at any rate, I can't get to it. For some reason, it won't move so that I can get to my.
Hey, Noel, you should
Yeah.
be able to grab that the Zoom control bar and move it. So that's out of your way.
Oh, thank you, dear. Okay. So helpful, Haley. Thank you. So on our weed page of the Flathead County website, there's a little button over here called calibration instructions. And that brings up a really slick little worksheet that walks you through how to calibrate. And this one specifically is for hand sprayers, but it's really pretty straightforward. So that resource is there for you. And like I said, it's just so important that you calibrate your equipment and know exactly what the output of it is, so that you can figure out exactly how to mix that herbicide in that tank. I'm more than happy for people to come in. I don't have the time to calibrate everybody's equipment for them, but if you do come in with your calibration or call with your calibration, I will be able to help you through the math of figuring out how much herbicide you would need to put in that tank in order to get the right mixture. So another thing that's really important is to make sure that you are familiar with the herbicide that you're using. And so what I did is I highlighted some things on this label. So this is just an example for you guys. Transline is a product that I recommend pretty frequently. It's one of the best ones if you need to spray in forested areas because it doesn't harm the trees at all. But here's what I want you to note is that you can find that information at the very beginning of the label. Usually it'll always tell you where it's legal and where it's labeled to be used. So for example, it says rangeland, pastures, forest sites, tree plantations, non-crop areas, airports, barrow ditches, right-of-ways, natural areas, and grazed areas. What you're not going to see on most of these herbicides is most of them are not going to be labeled for use on lawns. So if you do need to find something that's labeled for use on lawns, there are very few herbicides that are actually labeled and legal to be used in a lawn environment. Most of these are going to be for pastures and things like that. So you need to be careful because it is actually against the law to use an herbicide unless you're using it where it's labeled to be used. Another thing you'll find right in the beginning is the active ingredients. So some herbicides are a mixture of two different chemicals. Some are just one and then the other ingredients. So that information is right here. Gives you, so if you were to look up, how do I get rid of spotted knapweed? And it told you to use aminopyrrolid, you could type aminopyrrolid into Google or something and find the trade labels, the actual chemical or the herbicide names for what aminopyrrolid is, which is milestone, by the way. You want to make sure without a doubt that you find this section right here that tells you what personal protective equipment you want to wear when you're using these herbicides. Most of them are going to be long sleeve shirt, long pants, socks and shoes, and gloves, chemical resistant gloves. Not very many are toxic enough for like respirators or anything like that, but make sure you do before you use a product that you are familiar with what is required for personal protective equipment. You'll see the directions for use. Another important thing to make sure you look over, there's also going to be information in this agriculture use requirements part where it's going to tell you if you treat an area, how long before workers or, people can be back in it. So a restricted entry interval of 12 hours for this one. So, keep animals, children, employees, whatnot, out of the area for 12 hours after treatment. There will also, if you're using it in a field where you're gonna produce hay. There's going to be information about grazing and haying, whether or not, how long before the animals can be back on and eat that hay, or whether or not after you've treated it, it can be sold. There's usually, on many products, there'll be a window for how long after you spray you have to wait before you can sell that, so that the chemical has dissipated. It'll also, all the labels will also give a rain fast time. So a couple of things about rain and herbicide. When you treat with herbicide, you want to make sure that the plants are not wet, because what happens if you treat a plant that still has moisture on it, you're actually diluting the amount of chemical, right? Because you're adding the chemical to water that already exists. So you want to make sure that the plants are dried out. If it has rained before, you want to make sure that you wait long enough for the plants to dry. And then the label will tell you how long after you treat it that it'll be rain fast. So this product is 2 hours. There'll be mixing directions. Oops, I went a little too far. There'll be mixing directions. Frequently, you'll also be able to find on a label what you can and can't mix together. Like if there's herbicides that you can put together to make it more effective, it'll tell you which ones you can, and it'll tell you which ones that it doesn't mix well with. Then also, and this is pretty important, you'll find a list of plants controlled by the given herbicide. Everyone will have a list like this. They frequently look different. They don't, there's not consistency with different labels or different manufacturers, but there will always be lists of broadleaf or the weeds that are controlled by the product. So that's a really important one. And a lot of them will actually tell you not only which weeds are controlled, but it'll break it out to give you the actual amount of product that you need for each specific plant, because some take a little bit higher concentration than others. So a lot of them will give you that information too. And see that this one's just set up a little different. So the application rate is in this chart right here, instead of breaking it out in the list of plants controlled, but it'll still give you that application rate in pints per acre. And rates will always come in a volume per acre. And that's why you do the calibration on the spray equipment, is because you figure out how much is coming out of that sprayer, and then we can figure out how much product you need to get that application rate, that volume per acre. I don't know if there's anything else I needed to show you on this label, but we're just, nope. Okay. So mentioned that I would talk about alternatives to herbicide. So there obviously is some sensitivity to herbicides. Many people don't want to rely on chemicals, and that's totally understandable. So I frequently get questions about biocontrol. So biocontrol is just the wording for really bugs or fungus or some kind of other organism that attacks the noxious weed. There are only a handful of noxious weeds on our list that actually have biocontrol available for them. So that limits what you can target with biocontrol. In addition, the biggest message I like to give people about biocontrol is that it's not a tool to use to completely get rid of your noxious weed issue. And that's because when you look at any organism, it's not going to eat itself out of house and home, so the biocontrol will come into a balance with the plant community. So you may put a bunch of biocontrol out there and it'll eat down, your noxious weed community, but then the biocontrol agent, the bug, they'll start dying off because they've starved themselves out. And so then, your noxious weed issue comes back, and then maybe the population of bugs comes back and knocks it back down. So you're kind of like working towards this synergy, this happy medium, but biocontrol is never going to completely rid you of your noxious weed issue. In addition, it's really not effective unless you have a big enough problem to create enough food source for the bugs. So it really doesn't work on anything under like a 5-acre infestation. We really kind of target 5 acres or more when we recommend or when we assist with biocontrol. And it really is most effective in situations where there's really no other option. So think a lake back in the backcountry in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, where it's so many miles back there that trying to pack in the spray equipment and the chemical and find a water source and those kind of issues really complicate the situation. Bringing biocontrol into a situation like that may be the best answer. But really, if you just have a small infestation of, say, spotted knapweed in your pasture, and you just prefer not to spray it, biocontrol is not going to do you any good, unfortunately. So there's a really great, and again, all of these links are going to be available on the Conservation District's website. But if you want to know more about biocontrol, the Montana Biological Weed Control Coordination Project is a fantastic resource. It's really informational. It's got great stuff on there. It even can tell you where you can order your own biocontrol if it's something that you do want to try. So that is a great resource if that's something that you want to learn more about. Another alternative that some people want to look into is grazing. Can I get animals to eat the weeds? Unless you're familiar with what you're trying to accomplish, I would suggest reaching out to me or somebody else if that's the route you want to go, because there are some of the noxious weeds that are poisonous to horses and cows mostly. Sheep and goat aren't generally affected by the same things that are poisonous to cows and horses. So if grazing is something that you want to use as a weed control tool, sheep and goats are your best bet for that. I do get questions on whether people rent goats for weed control, and that is a thing some places. When in my previous life, I did natural resource work for the Port of Portland at the Portland International Airport, and they actually put some goats out in a section that they couldn't, it was a big mound of dirt that they couldn't spray because they couldn't get the equipment up there. But it's not really, first of all, no, I don't know anybody that rents out their goats here. And one of the biggest reasons is I think people have tried it before. but we have a lot of predators, natural predators here. So you put goats out into a field and it's like a dinner bell for wolves and grizzlies and cougars and whatever may be in the area. So I have talked with people that have had success with their own personal goats because they have, you know, dogs that will guard the herd or whatnot. But there, to my knowledge, is not a rental option in this area. And then obviously manual removal, pulling. One thing that I will point out with going out and pulling, you don't want to use bare hands because a lot of these plants have some kind of toxin in them and can either just really irritate your skin or actually make you sick. And then cultivation is another one, kind of the idea that you keep turning up the dirt to keep the plants from being able to grow. So as far as the county goes, I mentioned rental sprayers. So we have a few programs. We do rent spray equipment, either hand sprayers or tanks that drop into the back of a pickup truck. So with those, we have 5 100-gallon options and 1 200-gallon tank. A 100-gallon tank will treat about 5 acres because those are calibrated to put out 20 gallons per acre. So those are $55 a day to rent or $65 for a weekend. So those are available. The hand sprayers are $12, I think, for 2 days. Along with what I do at the county, as far as being a resource, I also deal with complaints. So if you're working really hard to keep your situation under control, but your neighbor isn't, you can file a complaint with our office and I will follow up on that and try to get that neighbor to start doing their part. Like I said, we also offer identification and I do offer on-site assessments. So you can call and schedule an appointment with me and I'll come out and walk the site with you, kind of tell you what you're up against and maybe what your best options are for management. We also have a crew of 5 guys that are out spraying, treating the right-of-ways to keep them weed free. That's important because roadways are a serious vector for weed transfer. So if we keep the road edges clear, that helps keep our entire valley more clear of noxious weeds. And that's kind of the weed portion of our department. But definitely, I think at the end of this, during our question and answer period, my contact information will be up on the screen. So you can take that down and get a hold of me with any questions that I don't have the opportunity to answer. But I think that's about it, Haley.
Great. Well, thanks for that. Really wonderful presentation as always. We do have a few questions in the chat box that are coming in, but I think I'm going to kick us off with a question, if you don't mind.
Please do.
You talked a lot about, calibrating sprayers and doing larger areas, but I was hoping you could also touch on maybe some of those options for homeowners that are just looking to do some spot spraying along their paths or sidewalks or maybe around their flower beds, things like that. And is it okay to, or would you recommend getting those pre-mixed jugs that just have the little squirt handle already attached?
There are a couple of products that are available in the pre-mixed, for sure. Generally speaking, with those kind of situations, especially if it's like a path or something like that, I would recommend Roundup. And I know a lot of people are hesitant to, and have their qualms about Roundup. And I would love to go into a further conversation with people that do, because it is a longer conversation, but it's definitely a safe product to use, especially for homeowners that are only using it like 1 or 2 times a year. If you're not using it every day, all day in your line of work, you probably aren't going to have any kind of exposure that's going to be dangerous. So there are a few products, pre-mixed products, but if it's like a lawn situation, really in a lawn situation, there's a product called Trimec, and that's really going to be your best bet. That's really one of the only ones available locally that is going to work to get rid of some of these tougher weeds, or just, weed and feed or something like that. But I mean, or pulling, but there's not really just a broadleaf specific pre-mixed when it comes to these more effective products that I was discussing.
Okay, thanks for that.
Yeah.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and jump into some of the other questions that participants have submitted. We have one that's kind of a similar question about some alternatives. They ask, can you speak to horticultural vinegar and what it works on and what it doesn't? And are there safety considerations?
That's a good question. Vinegar is effective in a Roundup kind of way. You're going to burn everything that it touches. So it's not something that I would recommend for somebody to use in their lawn, unless you plan on going back and patching all of those areas with seed. The most important thing to think about if you're going to do something that's going to kill everything it touches, like Roundup or vinegar or whatever in a lawn situation, is that every blank spot you make is another opportunity for a weed. So unless you cover bare ground with a desirable vegetation, you're going to have an open place that's going to be attacked by noxious weeds or infested with noxious weeds. So your biggest preventative measure that you could do to keep from getting the noxious weeds is to have a robust, desirable plant community. So is there any safety concerns with vinegar? You really don't want to use vinegar in your water if you have like a pond or something, because a lot of these, there are multiple of these herbicides that I can talk you through that are actually safe to use next to water, but vinegar is going to change the acidity, obviously, of that water body, which can lead to water quality issues. So, and it'll leach into the ground and can cause the same issues in your groundwater if you're using mass quantities of it. But I guess I hope that answered the questions.
I think so. Yeah. All right. So we had a question come in as well about burning. This question is about using a torch to burn individual plants. But Noel, I thought you could answer that and then also touch on burning in general as a weed control method.
Specifically using a torch on a specific plant, you're just burning the top of it. Unless it's a shallow rooted weed, you're not going to have any effect on that root. And you really need to get to the root of the problem with these noxious weeds, and you have to kill the root system. Otherwise, it's just going to keep coming back and coming back and coming back. Burning in general, a couple of things about burning in general for weed control. One, our burning window is in the spring here. That's not when fire naturally goes through this environment. So if you're burning in the spring, you could be damaging native plants that have just come up, that are not used to that burn cycle. So that's, for me, a big concern. Also, when you do these superficial burns, you're not getting the soil temps high enough to kill that seed bank. So you're, and again, you're not getting it hot enough to kill the root system. So you're really just burning the surface and not getting to the core of the problem. When I suggest burning it, it's not for weed control. It's in situations where you've had like say a fallow field that's just been wild for many, many years, and you have a large amount of biomass that's just built up and built up. And if you have weeds in that situation and you want to try to use herbicide to spray those weeds, you're not going to get as much contact with the weed surfaces if you don't get rid of that biomass. So I might suggest burning off all of that dead stuff sitting on the ground so that you have a clear spray area.
Great, thank you. Okay, this question is a little bit more specific. Randy asks, what works better on spotted knapweed, milestone or translime?
It totally depends on other factors. Here's why I won't answer questions for people when they call and they say, I have spotted knapweed, what do I spray on it? Because I need to know where you're spraying. I need to know if you have any water bodies nearby. I need to know if there's trees. I need to know so many other things. So both of those products are really effective on spotted knapweed and the correct usage, like in the right place. So if you have spotted knapweed growing in between trees, you're going to want to use translime because the milestone will do damage to the trees. But if it's an open pasture, milestone's a super effective tool.
Good to know, thanks. Okay, this is a new one for me. Let's see if you have any idea about this, Noel. This question is, does corn gluten meal work to prevent seeds from sprouting? And if so, how often does it need to be applied?
I have no clue. I apologize, but that's not something that I've ever heard of used here locally for weed control.
All right. Yeah, that's one I haven't heard of either. So maybe it's used in other places. Okay, so then we have another question asking for some tips for invasive yarrow and Dalmatian toadflax.
Again, without having more information about where the infestations are, how bad the infestations are, that's a really tough one to answer, because I leave myself open to liability by telling you to use something off the label recommendations as a government agent. So I hesitate to do so for that reason. But I'm more than happy if you do want to send me an email. I can send you a couple links that are like tech sheets for each one of those plants. It gives like a biological, talks about the plant itself, and then it also gives recommended both non-chemical and chemical management options in a chart. So I'd be more than happy if you wanted to shoot me that question in an email to address it more thoroughly.
And thanks for the reminder, Noel. I just put your contact information up on the screen. Hopefully folks can see that now.
Perfect.
Okay.
Could you talk a little bit about,
Go ahead, Sam.
I was just wondering if Noel could talk a little bit about integrated weed management plans and, what that means kind of generally and why it can be important in some situations.
Yeah, that's a great question, Sam. Thank you. So if you were to receive a notification from our office, say I was just driving around and I happened to notice a pasture that had a handful of different noxious weeds in it, and I sent you an enforcement letter. We require that you respond to our office with a weed management plan, so that we can have that conversation about what might be the best course of action for you to get rid of the problem. And as far as what Sam was asking about, an integrated plan, in many cases you don't, well, in all cases, you don't just want to, for example, go out and spray 2,4-D every year forever, because one, you can cause herbicide resistance in the weeds. You can actually create a situation where the herbicide doesn't work on the plants anymore. Also, if you're thinking about any problem, it's always good to come at it from different angles. So if we work together, maybe herbicides make sense in a certain area of your property, but because of a garden or animals or children or something in another place, something else might work better. So we can look at the whole picture and come up with ways to deal with the situation from different angles.
That's a great question. Kind of tiered off of that, Noel, can you talk about any plants that should not be pulled? Like, are there any plants where if you hand pull them, it triggers them to sprout more? Is that a thing?
That is a thing. The first one that comes to my mind are the hawkweeds. So orange and meadow hawkweed are the two hawkweeds we have around here that are on the noxious list. They grow via stolons, so like a strawberry plant. So when you pull them, it breaks up that root system and triggers them to like try harder to grow. They're under attack, so they're gonna spread faster. Trying to think of the other one that does that. We have a really nasty one called knotweed. It's a shrub that people used as an ornamental shrub next to houses. If you cut that plant, like say you just wanted to go out and weed eat it and get rid of it, every piece of that plant that breaks off can sprout into a new plant. I literally dealt with a landowner that she realized that, and so she had just taken clippings from the big shrub that they had in their field and just poked them into the ground along her fence to make a screen, like a privacy screen. And each one of those sticks that she stuck in the ground turned into a new plant. So yes, definitely there are some that you don't want to pull.
Okay, good to know. All right, we have a couple more questions in the chat box. They're pretty specific though, so we'll see, Noel, if you have any answers to these. Otherwise, we can keep chatting about maybe some of the more general concepts. So this one is, what would you suggest for managing Canada thistle growing along a stream?
So streams are tricky, and it depends on things like the steepness, accessibility, things like that. If you can get to the edge of the water and spray up, You can use 2,4-D. 2,4-D can be used right to the edge of water. Cutting it repeatedly over and over and over and over again, but we're talking like cutting it every couple of weeks for years. That can be effective, because eventually if you just keep cutting it so frequently, it keeps trying to grow, but eventually you're going to drain that the energy in that root system. But that's a really energy intensive method. So that would be something that really I would rather go on site and visit and see with my own 2 eyes what I would recommend.
Okay, great. So then the next question is, what is the best method of eradication for, I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, Ailanthus, also known as the tree of heaven?
Oh, golly. Yeah, I haven't talked about that since I left Oregon. That's not on our noxious list here. But yeah, that's a site specific question, because I'd have to see where it was growing. I'd have to see how big it was, things like that. Unfortunately, I don't
Hey,
have
Noel.
a quick, easy answer.
Noel, I had a question about the noxious weeds lists, and I think you already probably described this, but I always end up confusing myself. So there's the Montana State Noxious Weeds list, and then there's the Flathead County Noxious Weeds list. So does the Flathead County Noxious Weeds list include all of the ones on the state list plus those ones designated for Flathead County specifically? Or are you only required as a landowner to address those specific Flathead County weeds if you live in Flathead County?
No, you're required by law to attempt to get rid of all of them on both lists. The only purpose of the Flathead County list, like I said, was that each county is different, different agricultural practices, different ecotypes, different, things like that. So each county is given the ability to, in addition to the state list, add their own subset list. So all of them, you got to deal with all of them. And in that, if just a side note, the way that the plants get put on those lists, so it's like a legislative process to get them on the state list. And I think every year there's an opportunity to submit plants that if you want them to be considered for that list. And in Flathead County, you would submit a request to our board, and the information for our board is on the Flathead County weed page. So if there's something that you see that you think is running rampant across Flathead County, you can definitely reach out to our board members and they will consider whether they want to add that to our list or not.
Great. All right, Noel, I was hoping you could touch just a little bit more on when the chemicals carry over, particularly thinking about when herbicides are sprayed on a pasture and then you have livestock there. And even if that herbicide doesn't harm the livestock, I know people have struggled with using manure in their garden only to find out that it kills everything in their garden because that herbicide carried over.
Yes, good question. So basically what happens when an animal ingests the herbicide, herbicides are formulated to affect living plant material. So that's what they're targeting. When they're ingested by an animal, they just pass right through the digestive tract because they're not created to have an effect on a cow. They're created to kill a plant. So some of these labels will even say, if you have animals grazing in the area that's treated, don't allow them then to go into an area, a sensitive area, because if a cow eats that grass that's been treated and then it goes and poops in your garden, that chemical is still active in its excrement. So that's why you have that carryover problem. A lot of these have pretty short half-lives, which means that they become ineffective fairly quickly, like within most of the time weeks. But there's some that don't. So it's really not a good idea to use manure that you don't know where it's coming from, or what the animal's been grazing on. It's also not a good idea to use grass clippings as a form of fertilizer, because the same issue can happen. It's also, I got a phone call actually yesterday from a lady who lives by the power lines, and she said, I live by the power line corridor, and I see the county come out and treat the weeds out there. She's like, but then I went and I dug up some of that dirt to use in my raised beds, and my tomatoes didn't grow. Do you think it's because of the herbicide? And I said, yes, 100%. Like, that's a really not a good idea to not to just harvest dirt and not know, what's been put on it before you try to grow things in it. So, yeah.
And then, sort of as a follow-up question, can you talk about the safety of herbicides or any precautions we should take with regards to our pollinators, and maybe touch on the difference between herbicide and insecticide?
Great question. So, like I said, herbicides are formulated to negatively affect living plant material, for one. So the overarching term is pesticides. Pesticides are insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides. Insecticides are obviously targeted towards insects, herbicides to plants, fungicides to mold and fungus. So for the most part, herbicides should not negatively affect pollinators. Caveat: one, you shouldn't be spraying herbicide on plants that are flowering, because that's the wrong timing, first of all. Second of all, there are two herbicides that are pretty commonly used that are known to affect the nervous system of bees and other pollinators and bugs. And those are two of the most commonly used herbicides, 2,4-D and glyphosate or Roundup. So really important not to be treating flowering plants with herbicides, because if you're not treating the flowering plants, you're avoiding that possibility that the insect is going to come in contact with that herbicide.
Okay, great. Well, that's all the questions that I had written down. Samantha or Fiona or anyone else out there still in the audience, any last questions for Noel? Okay, hearing none, Noel, I think we can go ahead and call it. It is 7:05, so we kept to our schedule pretty well. All right.
Thank you all so much for participating. Thank you, Haley and Sam and Fiona, for putting this together. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure having you as a presenter, as always. Such great information. I learn something new every time I talk with you. So, okay. All right. Well, and thanks
ladies. Have a
everyone
great
for
night.
joining us tonight. And don't forget to take that survey.
Thank you, Noel. Good night.
Good night.